Eylau left Napoleon with the battlefield, but not the victory he needed. 4 months later, near a small town on the Alle, Bennigsen would give him another chance. The question was whether Napoleon could turn it into the decisive result that Eylau had denied him. 4 months before Friedland, Napoleon had remained in possession of the battlefield at Eylau. That fact allowed him to claim a victory, but it did not end the campaign. How should Eylau be judged? If an army gives up the field but remains capable of continuing the war, is that a victory? Leave your answer in the comments. The fighting had cost both armies tens of thousands of casualties. Augereau's 7th Corps had been broken apart in the snow. Murat's cavalry had paid heavily to stop the Russian advance through the French centre, and Davout's attack on the Russian left had stalled after Prussian reinforcements reached the field. Bennigsen withdrew during the night, but he took away an army that could still march, reorganize, and fight again. Napoleon had gained the ground. He had not removed Russia from the war. The Fourth Coalition remained active. Prussia had suffered major defeats, but Russia still fielded the coalition's strongest army. Napoleon needed time to restore his formations before another campaign. During the spring of 1807, the French army recovered while the siege of Danzig continued on the Baltic coast. A Prussian garrison under General Friedrich Adolf von Kalkreuth held the city, which threatened French communications and offered the coalition a possible point of contact with the sea. Marshal François Joseph Lefebvre directed the siege. Danzig capitulated in late May. Its fall released troops for field operations and made the French rear more secure. The practical difficulties did not disappear. East Prussian roads remained poor, transport columns were slow, and every advance increased the distance between the army and its main depots. The next clash would not begin with Napoleon choosing the ground. It would begin when Bennigsen found one French corps ahead of the main army, and believed he still had time to destroy it. Bennigsen reopened the campaign. On the 5th of June, the Russian commander attacked Marshal Michel Ney's 6th Corps. Ney had been posted ahead of the main French concentration, and Bennigsen hoped to strike him before Napoleon could assemble the rest of the army. Ney avoided destruction through a controlled withdrawal that kept most of his corps together. Once surprise was lost, Bennigsen pulled back. Napoleon followed. On the 10th of June, the two armies fought near Heilsberg, where the Russians occupied prepared defences. French assaults failed to dislodge them and cost Napoleon about 10,000 casualties. Even so, Bennigsen left the position during the night. He had stopped the immediate attacks without ending the pursuit. Napoleon expected the Russians to continue toward Königsberg, the main Prussian base in the region. The city held supplies and remained politically important. It could also bring Bennigsen closer to the surviving Prussian forces commanded by General Anton Wilhelm von Estock. The French advance covered several routes. Strong formations moved toward Königsberg. Marshal Lannes, commanding the Reserve Corps, was sent toward the crossings near Friedland on the Alle River. Only part of the French army was close enough to support him quickly. Bennigsen did not take the route Napoleon expected. His army moved northeast along the eastern bank of the Alle. By the afternoon of the 13th of June, Russian cavalry patrols had reached the area around Friedland. The first reports appeared to offer Bennigsen a useful opportunity. Russian scouts had found French troops west of the river, and the force looked isolated. Lannes had roughly 15,000 men immediately available. If the crossings at Friedland could carry troops fast enough, Bennigsen could bring a much larger force against him before the rest of Napoleon's army arrived. He ordered the attack. Bennigsen was not yet choosing a battle with the entire Grande Armée. His immediate aim was to defeat the French corps in front of him, clear the route, and recover room to move toward Königsberg or withdraw under better conditions. Russian troops began crossing the Alle. The river curved around Friedland, and the existing bridges could not move an army across in a single passage. Engineers prepared additional crossings, while infantry, cavalry, guns, and ammunition passed through the town. Units reached the western bank in stages, which delayed their deployment and made the early attack less concentrated than Bennigsen intended. Lannes soon recognized that he was not facing a minor rear guard. More Russian formations appeared, and pressure spread across a wider front. He sent an urgent report to Napoleon identifying the force as Bennigsen's main army. Then he began to trade ground for time. Lannes could not defeat the Russians with the troops already present. He had to keep contact with them without allowing his corps to be crushed before help arrived. Skirmishers screened the main positions. Local counterattacks slowed Russian advances at threatened points. When the pressure became too strong, French units withdrew far enough to avoid being fixed in place, then formed again behind the screen. The method also made French strength difficult to judge. Russian commanders could see resistance across several sectors, but they could not easily tell how much infantry stood behind the skirmish line or when another French corps might appear. By evening, the Russians had gained ground, yet Lannes was still holding west of Friedland. Bennigsen continued to send troops across the river. During the night, engineers worked on additional pontoon bridges so that more infantry and artillery could reach the battlefield before morning. By dawn on the 14th of June, most of the Russian force intended for the battle had reached the western bank. Bennigsen now held a large numerical advantage over Lannes. At the same time, the army's withdrawal depended increasingly on the roads through Friedland, the bridges over the Alle, and the limited crossing points farther north. At first light, Bennigsen ordered the attack to widen. The Russian army was still completing its deployment. Some formations were already engaged west of Friedland. Others were moving through the town or forming after crossing the river. Lannes used the uneven arrival of those units to prevent Bennigsen from bringing his full weight against one point. Napoleon had not yet reached the field, and the decisive attack was still hours away. When it came, its turning point would not be Ney's first advance. It would be the decision to move 30 guns forward into the ground, where the Russian left had nearly stopped him. The French line extended between Heinrichsdorf and the woods south of Postenen. Lannes did not have enough infantry to hold every part of that front in equal strength. Wherever Russian pressure increased, he pushed skirmishers ahead of the main line. They forced the Russians to deploy and delayed their approach while concealing the gaps behind them. The northern sector soon became dangerous. Heinrichsdorf stood close to the roads. French reinforcements needed to use. If Russian troops captured the village and moved beyond it, they could turn Lannes's left and interfere with Mortier's approach. Bennigsen sent cavalry toward the area to open that route. General Emmanuel de Grouchy arrived with French cavalry in time to contest the movement. The action developed through repeated charges as both sides fed fresh squadrons into the same sector. Grouchy did not need to chase the Russian horsemen far from the field. He needed to keep the road usable. After more than an hour, the immediate threat had been checked. Heinrichsdorf remained in French hands, allowing Marshal Suendeward Mortier to bring the 8th Corps onto the battlefield. Mortier strengthened the center and gave Lannes enough depth to reinforce the points under the heaviest pressure. Farther south, the fighting continued around Sortlack Wood. General Nicholas Oudinot's grenadiers faced troops from Prince Pyotr Bagration's wing. The woods broke up formations and restricted visibility. Russian infantry used its superior numbers to force the French back in places, but Oudinot's men did not abandon the area. They gave ground, reorganized, and continued to hold the approaches through the trees. That was sufficient for Lannes. He was not trying to win the battle in the morning. His immediate task was to prevent a breakthrough and keep Bennigsen committed until the approaching French columns could reach him. By late morning, the Russian commander had failed to destroy the isolated force he had crossed the Alle to attack. French reinforcements were now visible on the roads from the west. The victory that followed would lead Napoleon and Alexander to Tilsit, where the settlement reshaped Prussia and changed the relationship between France and Russia. We will return to the consequences of that agreement in a later episode. For now, the battle still depended on whether Lannes had held long enough. Napoleon reached the battlefield around midday and established his command position near Postenen. Lannes was still fighting. Bennigsen's army was already heavily committed on the western bank. Victor's 1st Corps was arriving, followed by Ney's 6th Corps and formations of the Imperial Guard. Other French units remained on the road, so Napoleon did not yet have every available formation in position. He first examined the ground. The Alle curved behind the Russian army and past Friedland, where the main bridges connected the battlefield with the eastern bank. A smaller watercourse known as the Millstream crossed the Russian position before entering the river. Its channel and steep bank separated the army into two main sections and restricted the routes available for moving reserves. Bagration commanded the Russian left south of the stream, where the ground narrowed toward Friedland. Gorchakov's larger right wing stood to the north. The two wings were not completely isolated, but support between them had to move through limited routes already carrying ammunition, wounded men, and units coming up from the river. Napoleon decided to strike Bagration's sector. Ney was ordered to advance from Sortlack Wood toward Friedland. If the 6th Corps drove the Russian left back, it would threaten the town and its bridges before Gorchakov could transfer enough troops south. Victor would support the main attack. Lannes and Mortier were to keep the Russian right occupied and prevent it from disengaging freely. There was a sound argument for waiting. More French troops would arrive if the battle continued into the following day. The position in front of Napoleon might not last that long. Bennigsen had crossed the Alle because he believed Lannes was isolated. Once he understood that Napoleon's army was concentrating against him, he could begin moving back to the eastern bank. Napoleon could not assume the Russians would remain in the same exposed ground through another night. A Russian withdrawal would also extend the campaign. French communications already ran across difficult roads toward Danzig and the Vistula. Königsberg still held useful stores and offered Bennigsen a possible link with the remaining Prussian troops. If the Russians escaped in good order, Napoleon would have to pursue them farther east while supporting his army over longer routes. A victory at Friedland offered a more immediate result. It could separate Bennigsen from Königsberg and force a decision before the French had to continue toward the Niemen. The 14th of June also carried personal significance. It was the 7th anniversary of Marengo, which Napoleon later linked with Friedland in a letter to Josephine. The date did not create the plan, but it added political meaning to a victory won that day. Throughout the afternoon, the French corps moved into their assigned sectors. Artillery came forward, staff officers carried the final instructions, and commanders adjusted their formations to the ground. Ney would begin from the right. Victor would support him after the Russian left started to give way. Lannes and Mortier were to hold until the main attack had drawn Russian attention south. At about 5:30, the French guns prepared to signal the advance. 3 artillery salvos opened the attack. Ney's 6th Corps moved out from the area around Sortlack Wood. His infantry cleared Russian troops from the edge of the trees, then advanced onto the open ground leading toward Friedland. Bagration's left wing gave ground at first. Once the French left the cover of the woods, however, Russian batteries near Friedland and on the eastern bank of the Alle had a clearer view of their formations. Artillery fire struck Ney's infantry in the open. The battalions had to keep moving while maintaining enough order to support one another. Casualties opened gaps, and several units began to lose contact with the formations beside them. Bagration reacted before the French could correct their alignment. Russian cavalry moved against the exposed infantry, while fresh troops reinforced the threatened sector. The French advance slowed. Some of Ney's units recoiled toward the woods, as officers tried to restore the line and bring scattered battalions back under control. The main attack had not reached Friedland. Russian troops still held the approaches to the town, and Ney's leading formations were under increasing pressure. The strength of the counterattack required immediate support. If Ney was driven back into Sortlack Wood, Bennigsen might gain time to withdraw across the Alle. General Pierre Dupont brought his division forward from Victor's 1st Corps. Dupont advanced on Ney's left and struck Russian troops that had concentrated against the 6th Corps. His arrival widened the French attack. Bagration could no longer direct the same weight of infantry and cavalry against a single line of advance. The fresh division steadied the assault, though the Russian left still held enough ground to block a quick breakthrough. French artillery now had to reduce its ability to remain there. General Alexandre Antoine Sidnarmont commanded the artillery of Victor's 1st Corps. He gathered about 30 guns from several batteries and placed them under a single direction. Rather than leave them well behind the infantry, he moved the guns forward in stages. Each move shortened the range and exposed the crews. The gunners brought the pieces up, unlimbered, fired, and prepared to advance again. Whenever the infantry secured the next position, Russian troops tried to stop the batteries before they could close the distance. Cavalry attacks forced the French gunners to depend on nearby infantry, and Russian cannon continued to fire into the advancing line. Senarmont kept the guns concentrated and brought them closer. At the shorter range, French fire struck Russian formations confined between the Millstream and the Alley. Bagration had little room to shift damaged units away from the bombardment without weakening another part of the line. Formations trying to reorganize found the available ground already crowded with reserves and troops moving back from the front. The artillery did not break the Russian left on its own. It made it far harder for Bagration's troops to contain Dupont and Ney at the same time. French infantry moved forward again. Bagration's wing began to fall back toward Friedland. Some units withdrew under orders. Others lost their alignment as they approached the roads into the town and became mixed with troops already moving toward the crossings. Russian reserves attempted to form another line, but the space available to them continued to shrink. Around 7 in the evening, Russian Guard formations entered the fighting near Friedland. Their counterattack delayed the French advance and gave retreating units more time, but it did not drive Dupont and Ney away from the approaches to the town. French shells had begun to set buildings on fire. The fires did not close every route, but they added to the difficulty in streets already carrying wounded men, artillery, infantry, and troops moving toward the river. Once the Russian left was moving back, Napoleon ordered more of the French line forward. Lannes and Mortier increased the pressure against Gortchakov's right wing. Gortchakov now had to withdraw, while the southern half of the Russian army was already being forced into Friedland. The Millstream slowed movement between the two wings. Troops north of it could not simply pass through the retreating formations to reinforce Bagration. By the time the Russian right began leaving its own positions, the main bridges near the town were carrying a growing mass of men and equipment. The Russian army did not leave the battlefield by a single route. Bagration's troops moved through Friedland toward the crossings over the Alley. Congestion around the bridges slowed them while French infantry and artillery pressed closer to the town. Some Russian soldiers attempted to cross away from the bridges and drowned in the river. North of Friedland, parts of Gortchakov's wing found other ways out. Some units reached a ford farther downstream. Others followed the riverbank until they could cross beyond the worst congestion. Those formations avoided the most serious disorder inside the town. Bennigsen preserved part of his army, but he could no longer hold the battlefield. The retreat continued into the evening, while French troops entered Friedland and occupied the western approaches to the river. French losses were close to 10,000 killed and wounded. Russian losses remain less certain, though common estimates place them between 18 and 20,000, including prisoners and missing men. The result went beyond what Napoleon had achieved at Eylau. After Eylau, Bennigsen had withdrawn with an army still able to continue the campaign under broadly similar conditions. After Friedland, his forces had suffered another major loss and were retreating toward the Niemen. The remaining Prussian army could no longer rely on Russian support at Königsberg. The Prussians abandoned the city soon after the battle. Marshal Nicholas Jan de Dieu Soult entered Königsberg with the 4th Corps, secured its supplies, and removed the coalition's main base in East Prussia. Bennigsen continued east. Distance did not solve the political problem facing Tsar Alexander. Continuing the war meant fighting without effective Prussian support, while French forces stood close to the frontier. A ceasefire was agreed on the 21st of June. 4 days later, Napoleon and Alexander met on a raft in the Niemen near Tilsit. Their negotiations produced peace between France and Russia and imposed severe territorial losses on Prussia. Friedland had not destroyed Bennigsen's army. It had changed the terms under which Alexander had to decide whether the war should continue. 4 months earlier, Napoleon had walked over the field at Eylau after gaining possession of the ground without securing the result he wanted. The Russian army also escaped complete destruction at Friedland, but this retreat was followed by negotiations rather than another phase of the campaign. The fighting that Eylau had left unresolved ended after Friedland, on the banks of the Alle,